Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the difficulty of Arkham Horror, the card game. It's no secret, this game is quite hard, whether it comes from the Chaos bag, or maybe the randomness from the encounter deck, or even just that the deck that you built isn't all that good. There's a lot of parts that can make this game quite challenging. But many newer players look at maybe more experienced players and see that they do quite well in the game most of the time. So, how is it that experienced players are full clearing scenarios? By that I mean they're getting basically all of the victory points and getting a positive resolution. How does this happen quite consistently? Well, there's a couple of important reasons why that I think beyond basic strategy tips, new players need to keep in mind that are different between a brand new player and a veteran. And those two major concepts we'll get into right now, what I'm going to call veteran habits. The first thing, of course, is having a deeper card pool. Now, I don't mean to say that this is the kind of game that in order to win, you need to buy more product. I think the core set, the new core set that has just come out, has quite good investigators and quite good cards in it, but there aren't that many choices. There aren't that many things you can do with your deck to make it a bit more consistent and a bit more synergistic. We'll get more into this in a bit, but just adding one more product, maybe the new Evergreen Investigator decks, will expand your options and make it much easier for you to have a better time playing the game. The second thing we'll talk about, and I think is maybe even more important, is the campaign knowledge that veterans have. That is, when you replay a scenario or a campaign, there's a lot more surprises that just aren't surprises anymore. A lot of things can happen throughout the course of the game that you just don't know on the first run, whether it's what happens when you enter a location, what kinds of encounter cards are actually in the deck, those sorts of challenges that are posed by individual scenarios, those aren't secrets anymore. So, what can you do with that campaign knowledge when you revisit the scenario another time? I think that makes a very large impact in your turn to turn decisions, and we'll talk about that afterwards. So, first things first, what does a deeper card pool do for you? I think having more cards means being picky. So, when you are first starting out and you just have the core set, there aren't a whole lot of things you can do about what goes into the deck. If you start with the pre-constructed deck, you'll notice that it has one copy of every card that your investigator can take, along with a few of the neutrals. Now, if you change your deck building a little bit and just include two copies of most of your cards that you really want, you're going to find that your deck is a lot better. That said, there are a lot of cards that you have access to that you just don't really want at all. They don't really make sense with your investigator, even though they are in the class your investigator has or is in their off class. So, with more cards, you can start filling in those slots of cards that just don't seem like your investigator wants them with cards that your investigator really does want. That's just the reality of having a relatively small core set. As soon as you start adding a whole lot more cards, you can choose which things are really the ones you want to play with. You can also double down on similar cards. So, for example, if you're a mystic like Dexter Drake, you only have a couple of ways to use your spells. So, there's basically only two copies of Second Sight for doing investigations, there's two copies of Cosmic Flame. Now, in the future, potentially in chapter two, but since we know this from chapter one, once you start to get more and more spells that do more or less the same thing. So we had originally Shriveling, which was a combat spell. And then later on, we got something like Azure Flame, which was almost the same card that was a combat spell, but it had a little bit different of a restriction on what happens when you draw particular tokens. It gave you more consistency in your deck. You now can say, I will be able to find a spell to deal damage without having to just keep randomly drawing cards through my deck until I find the one card I want. So the redundancy includes things like having more ways of getting resources, more ways of drawing other cards, more allies that fill a similar role. And now your deck isn't just a hodgepodge of different cards, but rather much more focused and therefore much more consistent. You'll be spending less time just wasting actions at the beginning of the game if you're pretty much ready to go no matter what your opening hand is. Now, what this also means is that the investigators that you pick will synergize with the cards in your deck as well. I kind of mentioned this in the sense of with an expanded card pool, you're picking the cards that you really want in your investigator, but you're also picking investigators themselves that follow a particular plan that you as a player have. For example, you have a concept that you want to see actually come to fruition. Well, there's enough cards and maybe the right investigator where you can actually do that. You want to play a investigator that has a lot of, say, money that they hold on to. We have this with Andre Patel's new deck where we have Well Connected, we have the Red Clock, we have lots of things that want you to have a lot of resources. Well, in chapter 1, there were also investigators that did this on their own. You had Jenny Barnes, who got extra resources, Preston Fairmont. There are many others that gained resources as part of their investigator ability. So now, not only do you have an idea of what you want to do with your deck, your investigator is helping that idea much more. It's not to say that we don't have that in the 5 or 10 investigators we have in chapter 2 right now, but you're a bit railroaded into what they want to do rather than you finding maybe more investigators that do better with the cards that you have. This also is, I think, related to the team composition. I talk a lot about this on the channel that veteran players don't just pick random investigators to play, but rather you are picking investigators that synergize with one another. Right now, with just the core set, you might, in say 2-player, just be picking 2 different investigators that don't share a card pool. So if you have picked Izzy Barnes, for example, who is Survivor and Mystic, you could play, for example, Joe Diamond, who is Seeker and Guardian, and you don't have to fight over any of the cards. Well, if that's the biggest restriction you have, the cards that you actually are playing with, then it limits the kinds of investigators and teams you can have. With a bigger card pool, you can have a lot more overlap in the investigators in terms of their card access because you're not fighting over the same cards. Now, that said, you're also more likely to pick investigators that have maybe some kind of an ability that makes sense with one another. Maybe you have something like Carolyn Fern who wants to heal horror, and then you also have Izzy who wants to take horror. That kind of synergy is really fun and is very effective, but also in terms of spreading out which stats we're good at. Someone might be really good at fighting, someone might be good at evading, someone might be good at willpower tests, all that sort of thing you can pick with a bit more familiarity and knowledge of the card pool and the investigators. Whereas newer players might just say, hey, I've never played a Mystic before, I'm playing Mystic next campaign. When I play with newer players, often I'm the last one to pick the investigator and deck build because I want to fill all the holes that have opened up with the other choices. It's not to say that the other choices were bad, but I, as a veteran, can say, okay, here's what we're missing. I can evaluate that, analyze that better than newer players can. Now, moving on, the cards in your deck, you also are going to be much more familiar with if you've had maybe more of a chance to look over all of your cards and make decisions about what goes in the deck. As I said a minute ago, if you're playing with just the core set, there aren't a whole lot of options of what you can do. Now, this causes your play patterns to be different. I know what these cards in my deck are for, and therefore I'm not just throwing them away at any skill test that pops up, but rather I need to hold them back for, enacting the exact plan I have with whatever synergies might exist in the deck itself. So I think this is an important concept that comes with just more familiarity with the game and with maybe playing the cards. I think that this tends to pop up towards the end of campaigns for newer players too. They get more used to learning their investigator, learning their cards, and then they know how to play them better. But your next go round with either the same investigator or the similar cards or the same cards in a future campaign, you'll know that from the get go, from scenario 1, instead of having to wait around a few scenarios to learn what really the strengths and weaknesses of the deck were. This goes for the cards themselves. Once you've played a card, you learn what the the best times to use it are, what are the not so great times to use it, and how to play around maybe some of the weaknesses themselves, the random basic weaknesses that are in your deck. All right, not much more to say about that, but I do think playing a little bit is going to help open up these avenues for what you're doing with the deck building. Lastly, I do think that veterans have a tendency of putting a lot of risky cards in their deck because they know that those cards are not that risky when they essentially play away from the weaknesses they have. So the biggest example of something like this is a chapter 1 card called Delve Too Deep. This is a card that you play it, everyone around the table has to take an encounter card, and then it goes into the victory display as a victory point for everyone. Very, very strong card. I think the designers may have missed how strong or easy it was to game something like this, because what players ended up doing with more experience is they say they don't just play it in the middle of a scenario, but rather everyone except for the person who has the delve can resign in a scenario that has that, and now only that one player takes the encounter card. Everyone gets the VP. Great. Now, there are other cards I think that have a similar idea. In chapter 2, we have a card called Will of the Cosmos. It's a strong card that lets you get 2 clues without getting any sort of test, and this card makes you put a doom on a card. Now, for newer players, this might look like, well, why would I want to do this? That seems scary. How am I going to get rid of the doom? Whereas veteran players are going to say, I can easily get rid of the doom. I'm not playing this card unless there actually isn't a downside. In other words, I'll put the doom on an ally I'm about to kill. I'm going to put the doom on a premonition that I just put into play. There's lots of different neat tricks that make this card actually not have any downside. The downside is just you can't play it until you can not have the backfire. So there's plenty of cards this way, ones that give you trauma for a price. Many veterans, swear by something like the cards that kill you if you're defeated. We had the Great Work most recently in the Drowned City. Because they just know I'm not going to be defeated. I'm playing around those sorts of things, and with a deeper card pool and more experience with the game, the mitigation is fairly easy. Not without a cost, but it's much less scary than it might seem for newer players. So those are kind of the few basic ideas I have about what giving you a deeper card pool does. And just mostly it's about options, but it's also about learning your cards too. So let's get into the campaign knowledge part. I do think this is quite important. What happens on your first play versus the second, third, etc., can be quite different. And I enjoy playing campaigns, I enjoy playing scenarios, I enjoy replaying them. So all of this that may make scenarios easier, I don't think it makes them worse or more boring. But we'll talk about that too. So the first thing is the investigator and team choice. What I hear veterans talk about all the time is I picked so and so to play because they're good in this campaign. Or remarking on other people's choices the same way. Oh, I bet they're really good in that campaign. New players don't, of course, know this. They don't know what that campaign is going to throw at them, whether it's something like the Forgotten Age, which really says you have to evade things. And, when anyone plays, say, a Kaimani Jones or Winifred in the Forgotten Age, they say, oh, yeah, you're going to do well. What veterans don't really say are, oh, yeah, I'm going to play this investigator because they're bad in this campaign. Sometimes as a challenge, I think that's fun and interesting. But for the most part, the veterans are going to look at their card pool and say, who is going to make this a little bit less frustrating, a little bit rough, less rough of a go through the encounter deck? And it's not just a single investigator, but it could be the entire team choice too, right? Bringing a team composition that meets the challenges well, or maybe even sometimes trivializes them, is something that veterans often do. I don't think it's a bad thing. You're generally going to have more fun if you win. There's a certain point to where too easy isn't fun, but picking a relevant or good investigator isn't a bad idea. And it's something you can only get once you've thought about what that particular campaign asks of me as a challenge. Everyone asks a little bit of a different thing. Some some campaigns are a little bit more open in what they're asking you to do. Now, beyond just the big picture, who would be good in this campaign, there's also all the little things that you get from each individual encounter card. So while you might bring a high agility investigator to a campaign like the Forgotten Age, you also are doing this because you know what's in the encounter deck and what things might pop up at any given time. So you have a better idea of what all of the encounter cards are in terms of enemies, how many enemies there even are. That allows you to prepare more in terms of what goes into your deck, of course, but also what you do in terms of your gameplay decisions. I have a Ward of Protection in my hand. That's for canceling a treachery, but which one do I want to cancel? And if you've played the campaign before, you probably know which ones are the tougher ones and which ones are the ones that I don't need to throw this ward at right now. You might say, I got to save that for something coming down the line. And only with the encyclopedic knowledge of the encounter deck are you going to be able to make those decisions optimally. There's more to it than this, right? It's more also about what is the encounter card that we might draw next round that's going to stop us dead in our tracks, right? Can I prepare around that sort of thing happening? Your first run of a campaign, you don't know that sort of thing. And even for veterans, they are just going to have to wing it. And that is fun too. But even while you're playing, you start learning what is the encounter deck like, what kinds of things might be popping out. Of course, when you're doing the setup of a scenario, at least whoever is doing that, you know what the encounter sets are. That tells you that right in the campaign guide. At least for the ones that you're used to from earlier in the campaign or from the core set, there will always be some encounter cards that are new for that particular scenario. But if there, for example, is cosmic evils in this particular scenario, I'm going to know that maybe we need to go quicker than usual. From chapter one, knowing that there is a chilling cold in the deck, rather the chilling cold set, and the crypt chill test, which makes me discard an asset, might make me play a little bit differently in my first few turns to make sure I have some assets out there to sacrifice, as it were, to failing such a test. So uh, that is not something I think all veterans spend time thinking about, but it can make the scenarios much more, I think, even engaging, in that the encounter deck is not just a random thing, but maybe even like another player you can think of that is somewhat predictable, somewhat, in how it behaves. Next, I want to talk about how players consider the act and agenda decks and knowledge of what happens on flipping those. Usually, when the agenda advances, something negative happens. Maybe an enemy shows up, maybe you do a tough test, maybe the encounter deck shuffles back in from the discard pile back into the deck and adds some more enemies or something else in there. And the act usually is good to advance, but not always. It might present some other challenges. It could spawn an enemy as well. It can just change the board state entirely. And if you know what's coming, then maybe you don't advance the act, which is the thing you pretty much have an option on all the time. You're not always forced to do so, although sometimes you are. So if you need to prepare a few more rounds before you know a big enemy is going to pop out, then great, do that. Of course, on your first play, these are some good ideas anyway, but you've got a better pace on your second or third playthrough of a scenario of what the pace of the scenario is like. You've got a better sense of, if I spend an extra round, am I more likely to lose? Or do we need to get going and we'll deal with the problem no matter what? Those are questions that are hard to answer if you don't remember what the scenarios were like beforehand. But I, as a player who plays the game a lot, I can't help but remember these sorts of things. There's little details that I don't remember all the time, but for the most part, I'm always thinking about these in the back of my head. I don't forget these kinds of things. I do know players who don't play a campaign for several years, and it's as if they played it for the first time. And I'm not that way. I know some people are, but it's a blessing and a curse, I think. Anyway, this is not true just of acts and agendas, but also moving around the map. If I know the map, I know what happens when you go into various locations. I don't need to go into those locations until I'm ready. I might want to for various reasons, but I don't have to. I'm not spending actions just exploring, as it will, the map. I just will take my actions when I think they're the most efficient to move around the map. So that's another thing that newer players say, well, let's just find out what's in there and let's just pretend an enemy spawns from that. How much damage and horror are you saving yourself by not advancing earlier, right? Last action spending clues to spawn an enemy, for example, in scenario 2 of the new core set, that seems like something you might want to think about. But if you're new to that scenario, you might just blindly advance and say, well, but that could be the difference between winning and losing the scenario, or even just dying early, an early defeat. Knowledge of the scenario is one thing, knowledge of the campaign guide is another. If you're playing through a second or third time, you might be trying to follow a different path than you did before. A lot of campaigns have various paths through the campaign. You're following someone's story, and you have to make various decisions in order to, fully follow their story. And it's okay if you want to follow a different path than you did before. You need to know what the resolutions you need to hit are. So that means being a bit more efficient what you're doing in the actual scenario. That helps you get there. You might know that a particular NPC wants you to do something in this particular scenario. Well, you better try to do that. So the consequences for your decisions in the scenario, as well as outside of the scenario in the campaign guide, lots of different choices you have to make. I think it's in it's in genre for this to be a bit random your first time. I think many players don't like the gotcha moments that can pop out in this game. I think they've gotten a bit better at them over the years. The Forgotten Age was a bit notorious for you didn't know what any of the supplies did, but on a second or third playthrough, this isn't a surprise anymore. You can choose what actually will help your team and what kinds of consequences you want to avoid. So this is like campaign guide knowledge, which even extends to who is the lead investigator. I think there are some general rules that I think are good for this. You want your fighter generally to be the lead investigator, but sometimes there's random other things that the lead investigator has to do that you wouldn't have known otherwise. Last thing, and maybe this is the most obvious for people who are watching this, well, what about tech cards? These are cards that solve specific scenarios or campaigns. At least they punch way above their weight in a particular campaign. This can be as simple as if I'm playing Pat the Carcosa, I'm bringing fine clothes for that second scenario. I'm bringing an enchanted blade or some kind of spell to deal with the poltergeist enemies in Carcosa. There's a lot of different things that are like this that may seem quite unfair in the first time you play. And then when you go back, you can say, yeah, I can handle that. Not a problem. This can be at the deck building stage, right? But it also could be later on if you get a card like Adaptable from the Rogue class that lets you switch cards in and out. The truth is that every scenario has a different challenge to it, and part of the design of the game is that not all decks will be good in every single scenario. That's okay. You're not supposed to be full clearing everything without knowledge. But usually, once you have that knowledge, you start thinking about those things. There's a large enemy that's going to spawn. I can deal with it in some special way with a particular card in my deck. And you hold on to those cards while you're playing that scenario until the moment comes up, which can be really fun. Which can be really fun to show off. Here's a card that I think would be really good for this particular variety of enemy. And if it works, great. Sometimes it doesn't, and that can be quite interesting. So tech cards are a good way to increase your winning percentage of campaigns like this by a huge amount. And it's hard not to have some amount of tech for a campaign. Again, even going back to the choice of investigator, that is kind of scenario or campaign tech too. So, just to wrap up these ideas, again, this is a very preliminary kind of big picture look at what is the difference between being an experienced player and a newer player going through a particular campaign. Because the reality is, a lot of these things are true for veterans who are playing a campaign for the first time, too. This new core set, I've talked to many veterans who have found it surprisingly difficult. And whether that was because they had a smaller card pool or they just didn't know the campaign, you only get your first time through a campaign once. I think it's worth mentioning that it's okay to go back and try again, and things will probably be easier. But part of learning the game is learning the scenarios. Learning your investigator, learning your deck, that's all something you can see again in a different campaign. But it is fun to learn the scenarios too. That it's funny. I don't think that having all this campaign knowledge, scenario knowledge, makes the game less good. You lose a little bit of the role-playing game uh, type of gameplay where you're just seeing what sticks, seeing what happens to your investigator who's up against an unknowable, undefeatable sometimes mythos. It turns it into more of a puzzle where you have a lot of knowledge about what can happen, but it's up to you to figure out how to move the pieces around the board in the way that will result in a positive resolution. But really, not just a positive resolution. These sorts of tips are for, as I said at the very beginning, for full clearing the scenario, for doing the best that one could possibly do. More cards, of course, will give you more ways to tackle the game. Moving those pieces around the board requires you to have maybe even quite specific cards that help your investigator and aren't as good for other investigators, but also might be good for a particular thing in the scenario. After you've played the core set, the new core set, Brethren of Ash, maybe go back and look at the cards in the core set and see if there are any that actually would help with a particular nasty enemy that you weren't thinking about earlier. A lot of "if only I had this card" can pop up. Look at the new Evergreen Investigator decks. Maybe there are a few cards there that are specifically good in one or more of the scenarios of the core set. Try playing with those instead and see what happens. There's always a bit of a give and take. If you put a card in, you have to take another card out. But that's the fun part about the game. Lastly, there are still challenges to be had. I don't want to make it sound like veterans are just making the game easy, because they aren't. There's still a lot of randomness from the chaos bag. You can have perfect knowledge and things still go very poorly. I continue to replay campaigns all the time, and it's still very fun and still quite a challenge. Now, that said, there are other ways to make the game challenging, right? You can increase the difficulty level if you feel like you're just cruising through too much, and you can impose some restrictions on yourself. Don't play with all of the cards. Uh, Maybe choose investigators that are more thematic in nature. Maybe have a little bit of a weird team that you're putting together that doesn't just immediately crush everything that shows up. That can make the game uh, still interesting and still challenging, despite the fact that you know what's going to happen in the scenario. So I recommend doing that, especially as veterans, to make sure the game is still interesting and puzzly. And I do find the games to be quite engaging, even if I've learned the scenarios quite well. That said, I think there's always something to learn about the game and the campaigns themselves, the scenarios, even after you've played them many, many times. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Let me know of your thoughts down in the comments if you're a new player or a veteran, if there are other things that you notice as being just categorically different between your first playthrough and after you've played multiple times. And just experience having played the game for multiple years, what are some things you picked up on beyond just basic strategy tips and learning the rules? Those things, of course, are very helpful, but what is different about having more cards to choose from? What's different about knowing what your scenario is asking of you? That's all. I'll see you next time.